Hello, welcome. My name is Gabriel, and today I am running you through all of the books that I read this summer. I'm not sure what the exact number is yet because I don't have them all in front of me, but I think we're somewhere in the 18 to 20 range. I don't know how I read as much as I did this summer because I was busier than I've ever been in my life. I was working full time, I was in a play at night, I was sleeping 4 hours at a time, but somehow in all of that I found a way to read 20 books. So let's get into it. I do have to say my notes were not very thorough and I've forgotten a lot of what happens in many of these. So I will be trying to scramble together something to say about all of them. But this is more just a documentation and me saying hey, I read this thing. Here is the impression it has left on me. And you can take that as you will. First up is a book that I don't have because I gave it away yesterday, and that is The Penelope Ad by Margaret Atwood. If you watched my mid-year freakout tag, you'll know that I used this as my answer to the question, biggest disappointment of 2021. And it's not that I thought this book was bad, it's just that I thought it would be better. So The Penelope Ad is a retelling of the Odyssey from the perspective of Penelope, the wife of Odysseus. I thought that it had a really cool use of language, especially at the beginning where there is a scene of Penelope in the underworld. It also has a really cool structure because it incorporates a Greek chorus who come in to read poetry and chant. I thought that was a fun way of playing with the overall flow of the story. And I have nothing to say about this book beyond that. I thought that it was a fine story, but it didn't wow me. Actually, the fact that Penelope was telling the story from the underworld, after the fact, really made it underwhelming for me, because she was telling all of the events as if they were a foregone conclusion, and there was no suspense and no reason to get invested. She was just listing, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and of course it happened that way. Why would you think that it could happen any other way? Why should I be creative, or interesting, or new? Maybe I do dislike this book. In terms of Greek retellings, I think Madeline Miller has set a really high bar, and this book has made me hesitant to pick up others in this genre that I have been looking at, like The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker, or Lavinia by Ursula K. Le Guin, I think. That's all. I didn't rate this book because this summer I really got into the mind space that just because a book doesn't wow me doesn't mean that it needs a middling 3 stars. Instead of thinking of books as a checklist or a point system, I should just experience the story and sit with it. I still gave star ratings to a lot of these books, you'll see. Up next, I read one that I actually have with me. Let's see. Blue Horses by Mary Oliver. I have seen a lot of people talking about Mary Oliver in the last year. Not that she's new, it's just a lot of people that I follow have gotten really into her. And I thought this was as good a place as any to start. This collection is all about nature and emotions. Mary Oliver really likes to wander through the woods and just write about how it makes her feel. I don't know, it's lovely. I don't really know how to review poetry. I gave this 5 stars, and I'm going to read some passages that I underlined because I think that her words speak better for themselves than I could. This poem is called If I Wanted a Boat. I would want a boat, if I wanted a boat, that bounded hard on the waves, that didn't know starboard from port and wouldn't learn, that welcomed dolphins and headed straight for the whales, that, when rocks were close, would slide in for a touch or two, that wouldn't keep land in sight and went fast, that leapt into the spray. What kind of life is it to always plan and do, to promise and finish, to wish for the near and the safe? Yes, by the heavens, if I wanted a boat, I would want a boat I couldn't steer. I really like Mary Oliver. I want to dive into her discography. What is it called for authors? Her canon? I don't Oh, after that, I reread The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. So I've been on something of a John Green kick, maybe a John Green renaissance the last year. Back in December, I believe, I reread Looking for Alaska and was just blown away by how much I still loved it. Because I didn't even like it that much when I read it when I was 12, but something about it really hit me this time around. So I decided to give another try at my favorite John Green book, or the one that was my favorite when I read all of his stuff in 6th grade. I'm looking for it like I have it here. I left it in Utah. But my favorite was The Fault in Our Stars, which is a book about two teenagers with cancer who fall in love. But this time going into it, I knew that it was a young adult romance, which is not my genre anymore. And I knew that some of the plotting choices don't really hold up. But I didn't realize until I started it just like how severely I am not the target audience for this book anymore. I will say John Green is excellent at creating memorable characters. People like to hound on him for how, like, quirky they are, but I think that it's a really good way to get people invested in characters as individuals. And even though I wasn't, like, loving this book as I was reading through it, I did get very emotionally invested, and the ending made me so sad. And I remember going into this thinking, like, oh my gosh, it's gonna be so fun to read it, but no, it just made me feel, like, deeply unwell. Final review, I didn't give this one a star rating either. It meant a lot to me when I was younger. I'm gonna keep it as a part of my life now. I think that it is excellent for the audience that it is written for, introducing the ideas that it does to the age group that it is trying to tell them to. This next one isn't a book, it's just a short story, and that is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I listened to this as a free audiobook while I was at work. I think I found it on Apple Podcasts. And this story is about a woman who is very depressed, and I believe that her husband and doctor diagnosed her with hysteria and believe that any excitement will be too much for her heart. And so they decide to lock her in a room where she has absolutely nothing to do but stare at the wallpaper all day. And throughout the story, you see her mental state crumble as she becomes obsessed with the patterns in the wallpaper. And I loved this. Oh my goodness. I thought that it was so smart and had such an incredible use of language. And I was just thoroughly impressed by this. A couple years ago, I read another book by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, which was Herland, and I enjoyed that one, but I wasn't, like, swept away by her prose like I was in this story. And I am very intrigued to check out more of her writing now. This story also reminded me a lot of Death in Her Hands by Ottessa Moshfegh. But that is another book about a woman in isolation who is driven to madness by, like, hyper-focusing on the minute details of her environment. After that, I read Dog Songs by Mary Oliver. I don't have this one with me because I gave my copy to my dad. He is an insane dog person, and I thought that just a little book of poetry about dogs would be perfect for him. This is just a collection of poems all about dogs. Mary Oliver loves her dogs. I thought that they were cute and touching and sad and lovely. After that, I read The Curse of the Winged Wight by Madeline Dyer. This was an audiobook that I got for free because a friend of mine narrated the audiobook, and they gave an incredible performance. That being said, I only took 2 notes on this book, and those are not good and fantasy retelling. So, The Curse of the Winged Wight is, I believe, a Sleeping Beauty retelling. I've, like, blocked out most of what happens in this. It's a young adult novel. There's, like, some kind of romance. I don't know, I didn't enjoy the first little bit of it, and so I kind of zoned out for most of the audiobook, but I remember talking to my friend about the plot, just trying to figure out what was happening. And at one point I said to them, like, so, the villains are the evil queen, the evil witch, and the ogre. And they're like, yes. And I was like, and those are 3 different characters. And they were like, yeah. And I was like, why? Okay, so there's, like, this girl who's, like, possessed by an evil fairy who makes dresses for an evil queen. I didn't like it. I don't know. I'm sorry. After that, I read Slouching Towards Bethlehem by Joan Didion, which launched me into the Joan Didion phase that I am in right now. So Slouching Towards Bethlehem is a collection of essays written by Joan Didion in the 60s, I believe. She was a journalist working for Vogue at the time, and a lot of these are about documenting the kind of hippie psychedelic drug culture in California in the 60s. But there are also essays about, like, John Wayne and about her habits keeping a journal. And they've all just got this incredible tone. She's really dry and funny and observant, and a lot of her humor just comes from what she sees other people doing. And she just states it so clearly to you and you'd get such a clear picture in your head of what's going on. You're just like, oh, Joan. Does that make sense? She's really non-judgmental too. She like clearly has an opinion of what's going on, and you'll get that while you're reading it, but she also allows you to develop your own feelings on what's happening by just clearly stating what's happened. Like, the people that she's interviewing trusted her enough to invite her into their homes for like weeks at a time and to interview them and just observe them. You walk away feeling like you have met these people and really been with them. After that, I read Autobiography of Red by Anne Carson, which I have with me. Oh wait, I have Slouching Towards Bethlehem with me. Jesus. Okay. Slouching Towards Bethlehem. Love this cover. I actually didn't know what this was when I saw it in Barnes & Noble. I was just like, that's a cool looking cover. And I picked it up. Here we are. Autobiography of Red by Anne Carson. So this is a strange one. It is translations of fragments of a lost Greek epic, which is about like a red monster who lives on a red island who is killed by Heracles as one of his like trials for Hera. But this story is told from the perspective of Geryon, this red monster. And it's so many things, actually. The book opens with these translations of the surviving fragments of the epic, but then she writes a novel in verse from the perspective of Geryon, but it's set in like the modern day, and it's told as a romance between Geryon and Heracles. But then there are also these like imagined interviews she has with the Greek poet who wrote the original epic. And then there's a translator's note, and then there's more poems. And this is really strange. It just completely changed my idea of what a book can be. I love Anne Carson as a translator, and I think that those fragments are incredible. I also think that the interviews she imagines with the poet are very clever and trippy. The novel in verse that she wrote is where I am conflicted on this book, because I think that the first half, from the perspective of Geryon as like a young child, is really cool, and I also think that the romance that forms between Geryon and Heracles is really sweet and tender. But then the second half of the novel is when Geryon is grown up, and it turns into this like traveling photographer story where he's trying to find a volcano, and I just couldn't really understand why she went in that direction. Have you ever read a book and you see like a plot choice made, and it's not that the writing is bad, you're just like, you could have written anything. Why this? This is another book that I chose not to give a star rating. I just think that the story is so unique, I want to just take it for what it is and sit with it. After that, I read Home by Toni Morrison. I read so many underwhelming books this summer. Oh, and I hate to say that about a Toni Morrison because she is still my favorite. So, Home is about a man named Frank Money who has just returned from a war, I believe, Vietnam. And he wakes up in a hospital bed and has to find his way home to Georgia. And it's the story of his journey home, and then also the story of his sister back home in their small town. I don't have much to say about this. It's just a very clean story, if you know what I mean. Like, the structure is very clear. The actions make sense. I don't know. Toni Morrison's a master storyteller. This is a good story. It's just not earth-shattering in the way that a lot of her other books are. I don't think that the prose was remarkable. It was just very clean. This book did have an excellent beginning, though, because, like, first page, Frank wakes up in a hospital bed, and he has to pretend to be asleep. And I thought that that was just an excellent beginning to a story. Like, oh, who is this man? How did he get to the hospital? Why can't anybody know that he is awake? And then after that, the story unfolds. This is fine. I think that in terms of my Toni Morrison rankings, this one has to rank at the very bottom. Even though I was unsatisfied by Jazz's plot direction, I still think the prose in that is absolutely incredible. And actually, I want to reread that one and just give it another chance because I feel like it might rank even higher. After that, I read Darius the Great is Not Okay by Adib Khorram. So this book is about Darius Kellner, an Iranian-American boy living in Portland, who visits Iran for the first time with his family when his grandfather is dying of cancer. And it is also about the friendship that he forms with a boy named Sohrab in Iran. I really enjoyed this. It's a lovely young adult coming-of-age novel with LGBT themes as well as a great discussion of mental health and depression. And I really loved the depiction of like the culture shock of going to Iran for the first time. I feel like I learned a lot about Iranian culture from this book, and I'm definitely intrigued to check out more Iranian authors. I gave this 4 stars. After that, I read The White Album by Joan Didion. This one is more essays that she wrote in the later 60s and early 70s, and it is fantastic. I think I only gave Slouching Towards Bethlehem 4 stars, but this one I gave 5 stars because every single essay, just like back to back, was a banger. The essay The White Album is remarkable. In it, she talks about how her job throughout the 60s was to be a journalist. It was her job to craft historical and political events into a narrative which was satisfying and comforting for the public to consume. But she talks about how the 60s and the social upheavals that came in that decade were so traumatic for her to witness firsthand that she was unable to craft them into a narrative that made sense to her, let alone to the entire world. The opening paragraph is some of her most iconic writing, so I'm going to read that for you now. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. The princess is caged in the consulate. The man with the candy will lead the children into the sea. The naked woman on the ledge outside the window on the 16th floor is a victim of assassination, or the naked woman is an exhibitionist, and it would be interesting to know which. We tell ourselves that it makes some difference whether the naked woman is about to commit a mortal sin, or is about to register a political protest, or is about to be, the Aristophanic view, snatched back to the human condition by the fireman in priest's clothing just visible in the window behind her, the one smiling at the telephoto lens. We look for the sermon in the suicide, for the social or moral lesson in the murder of 5. We interpret what we see. We select the most workable of the multiple choices. We live entirely, especially if we are writers, by the imposition of a narrative line upon disparate images, by the ideas with which we have learned to freeze the shifting phantasmagoria which is our actual experience. How does a person wake up and decide to use language like that? Anyway, my favorite essay in here is one called Bureaucracy, which is about the highway culture in Los Angeles. There's a passage in here which describes driving on the freeway as like a religious experience that really resonated with me because in Utah, the freeway is a very big part of our collective culture. We're a very commuter-based community. And so these lines just really made an impression on me. She says, "To understand what was going on, it is perhaps necessary to have participated in the freeway experience, which is the only secular communion Los Angeles has. Actual participation requires a total surrender, a concentration so intense as to seem a kind of narcosis, a rapture of the freeway. The mind goes clean, the rhythm takes over, a distortion of time occurs." She's a lunatic. Okay. After that, I reread Eileen by Ottessa Moshfegh because I had a suspicion it might be my new favorite book. After rereading it, I don't think that it's quite the all-time favorite. I think that The Secret History by Donna Tartt is going to hold that place for quite some time. But this book is just everything that I needed at this point in my life. I'm so happy that I found it. This book is about Eileen, who is a 26-year-old woman working in a juvenile prison in a small New England town in the 60s. She's living with her emotionally abusive father, and it follows her the week leading up to Christmas 1964, when she runs away from her hometown and never comes back. I read this twice this summer, gave it 5 stars both times. I will probably reread it often. After that, I read The General in His Labyrinth by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which was very interesting. I found this first edition at a used bookstore for $10, and I'm just amazed by it. This isn't the first Marquez book I wanted to read. I was looking for a copy of 100 Years of Solitude, but I just thought this copy was so pretty I might as well give it a shot. I also recognized the title because The General in His Labyrinth is a book they talk about a lot in Looking for Alaska by John Green. And this book is about General Simon Bolivar, who I believe was one of the generals who helped liberate South America from Spanish colonial rule. And it follows the general's final journey across South America when he has been exiled from Colombia? Venezuela? I didn't take great notes on this one either. But basically, the liberated continent of South America is breaking up into factions, and the people who used to love him have now exiled him from his home, and this book follows him on his journey to Europe. I don't usually like stories about like generals and military people, but somehow I read all the way through this book. I wasn't like swept away by the story, but it kept me intrigued. There were some really beautiful passages in there and some very clever dialogue, so I am excited to check out more of his writing. And actually, I'm going to do a little book haul for you guys because I was at a used bookstore the other day and I found two of his books. Chronicle of a Death Foretold and Love in the Time of Cholera. So still I can't find a copy of 100 Years of Solitude, but I will be reading one of these pretty soon. After that, I read a work of fiction by Joan Didion. I read her novel, Play It As It Lays. This book is about a woman named Mariah Wyeth, a model and actress in a failing marriage whose daughter is in the hospital. It is a brutal look at the hedonism of Hollywood in the 1970s. Another thing I love about Joan Didion is her handle of atmosphere. When you are reading this book, you can just feel the, heat of the California sun. You can, feel how stark and startling the desert is. The writing feels like that, too. It's, searing and startling, and, this book is just like being slapped in the face. It feels like you're getting heat stroke. In a good way. I had notes for this one. They all disappeared. I don't know. This book is incredible. It's about Hollywood and California and Nevada and gambling and womanhood in the 60s and 70s and marriage and motherhood and everything. I read this whole thing in one day. I was on a very long car ride and I just breezed through it. So I want to revisit it sometime soon. But I gave this one 5 stars, and I am very excited to check out more of Joan Didion's fiction in the future. Some other books that I read this summer but don't really want to talk about are The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I think that's the first one I finished. I talked about it in a vlog. I just kind of read it so that I can tell people that I've read it. I don't have anything insightful to say about it. And then, of course, I read all of Ottessa Moshfegh's books. She is one of my new favorite writers of all time. I am just obsessed with her. I made an entire video about her books. And then, a couple days ago, I finished reading War and Peace for the second time. I've talked about this one a ton. My feelings towards it haven't really changed. I think this time around, I got really tired of it really fast, just because I had read it before. I'm going to be having a live stream discussion of this book with Kelsey over at the channel I Read Today sometime in the next week. I think literally yesterday I announced it's going to be Wednesday the 25th, but I just got the schedule for my new job and that's not gonna happen. So I need to talk to Kelsey about when we can do that. Okay. Thanks for joining me for this chill video. In the future, I would like to take better notes on these books so I can give you more fully rounded reviews like I usually do. Well, that sounds cocky. That's all for today. If you liked this video, give it a big thumbs up and comment down below your thoughts on any of these books, or just tell me what you've been reading lately. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe as well as the bell icon so you get notified every time I upload. It's been once a month for the last little bit, but I'm gonna try to do better than that. That's all. I'll see you guys next time.